We're going to talk about implied terms. Feels like we didn't finish talking about express terms, but we did last night. So if you've got questions, we might need to circle back, but I posted the video about that. If you are listening online, stop, go back, look at that first because it might help you. All right, up to 1,000 points an answer. That sounds pretty cool. Still haven't sorted out the music. Probably not a good thing if I sing for you. Come on, something's going to happen here. Now I'm going to have to hit my... Do something. Come on. That wasn't me. Nor was that. 3 main categories of implied terms are accepted in common law, including terms implied by law, custom, and fact. What's another category of implied terms that has been acknowledged by the courts? Are you all ready to begin? Which of the following might be a term? Acknowledged by the courts. Maybe more than one applies, who knows? And your time is up. Come on. So, terms implied by legislation don't need to be acknowledged by the courts because the court's job is to, what is the word for it without being sort of too basic? It's to basically enforce the law. So if the law says this term is going in your contract, it's not really for the court to say, yes, Mr. Legislation, that's fine by us. Of course, their job in a different context is to work out whether the legislation is properly passed and whether it is actually a law. But from this point of view, we don't need that. An implied duty to act reasonably is an implied term. We're going to talk a little bit more about duties of good faith. So term implied by good faith, I'm not quite sure what that means. Whether or not there is a duty of good faith, well, the High Court says there possibly is, but even still working out what that means leaves something to be desired. But again, we'll talk about good faith later. Come on, wake up, little thing. No, okay, it's awake, it just doesn't, oh, no, it does want to move. What have we got? M's on fire. Implied terms cannot be excluded by parties to a contract. Is that a true statement or a false statement? Fingers at the ready. Whoop, some people have got in there very fast. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. So if I get... Okay, I've got 12 of you, so I'm going to work on the basis that I can move on. Okay, so vast majority see that this is false. Now, there are some terms, particularly terms that are implied by statute, where the statute will say you cannot exclude these terms. So there are some, but as a general rule, terms that are implied by law, terms that are implied even by statute, unless the part of the statute says you can't override this, the parties can agree something different. Oh, I have no idea what that loud noise was, but it was unpleasant. This is actually one of the things that many of you will have been thinking about when you were looking at boilerplate provisions doing the most recent assignment, that you might have noticed that some of the kinds of clauses that were in the boilerplate provisions in the Encyclopedia of Terms and Precedents, Forms and Precedents, would have included clauses that are designed to get around what the law would have implied. A good example of that would be notices clauses. So we know in the context of acceptance that if it's appropriate to accept an offer by post, that the time that the contract is made, so the deemed time that the acceptance is given, is the time that the letter is put in the post box, right? So that's effectively a timing provision that is implied as a consequence of the way the law works. But there's nothing to stop somebody putting in an offer. You can accept this offer by post, but the notice that you give us by post will be deemed to be received by us 3 days after the date that you post it. Or you can accept this by email. We know that the statute says an email is received at the time it's capable of being taken from the server. But you can say in your agreement or your offer, emails will be deemed to be received on the next business day, or like on the business day they actually arrive, but if they arrive after 5 p.m. or on a non-business day, then they'll deem to be received at 9 a.m. on the following business day, because you can do what you like. So again, sometimes that's true. See, I'm giving feedback as opposed to advice. So sometimes that is true, but not always. Guessed 1899. Is there somebody who was actually born in that year? No, 899. Okay. Weird numbers. In the English decision of the Moorcock, the English Court of Appeal held that the jetty owners... That's an apostrophe in the wrong place. That really bugs me. There was more than one owner, and that makes it look like a possessive, where clearly they possess the jetty. But anyway, that just really bugs me. The jetty owners were liable for damages. Why? Your options are, there was a breach of an implied term requiring the owners to take some care, reasonable care. The owners were in breach of an express term of the contract. The owners were in breach of a term that was implied by custom, or the owners were in breach of an implied term in fact requiring them to take reasonable care. We've run out of time, run out of answers. So a few people didn't do this one. Do you remember this case? It's in the readings, so bit of a mixture. 50% of those who answered found it. So effectively at the end, well, this is a case, not surprisingly, about jetty owners and a boat. So the boat was moored at this jetty. They paid money for the jetty, and it's on the Thames. So the Thames is a tidal river and it's quite low, so it goes down quite a bit. And those of you who've been to London will have seen those wide boats that they have that they don't go very deep because it's quite a shallow river, and because it's tidal, it goes in and out. And so this boat came in. It was at that mooring. And my memory is that when the tide went out, it went down to the bottom of the river, and there was nothing to protect the boat at the bottom of the river, and it was in bad repair. So there were rocks and damaged things, I don't know, leftover pirate flags and skulls, or what do you have under a jetty? Stuff. And so their boat got damaged. They then sued. They said, you know, we paid good money to be at this jetty. It was your job to make sure that the jetty was suitable for our boat and that the riverbed and the jetty were kept in reasonably good care. And the court agreed. They said, as a term of fact, that it's an implied term, but the very nature of what you do, it's not for the boats that come and go. They can't tell until the tide's out and their boat's already hit the bottom whether or not the area's in good repair. They're paying you money for it. It's incidental to the nature of the relationship that risk is your risk and that you're the one who's best placed to do something about it. Big jump. It needs music for that to be exciting, doesn't it? Sorry. Okay, is it possible, is it possible to imply a term in fact in an informal contract? Yes, provided the court strictly adhere to the BP Refinery and Shire of Hastings test. No, only when there's a formal contract. No, a term can only be implied by custom. Or yes, a flexible approach has been recommended by the High Court. Five, four, three, two, one. So, flexible approach. So informal contracts, actually the very nature of them, and I think that the fact that you understand that is borne out by the high numbers in these two areas. So an informal contract is likely to be, it's something verbal, it's something where the parties will require, not necessarily the law, but custom, their course of dealing, their general understanding of what the nature of the deal is to be carried with the terms. The more formal a contract is, the more likely the parties are to specify each of the terms and conditions and to classify them as conditions or warranties or otherwise. It's the informal contracts, like even just buying something in a shop, is about as informal a contract as you can get. You can often do it with no conversation, but there's this implied behaviour and custom that sits behind it. And yes, the High Court has recommended a flexible approach, so something more flexible perhaps than the BP Refinery and Shire of Hastings case. So,
question.
Sorry?
The High Court saying be flexible, that would be based on a case. Which case would it be?
Interesting, because that well and truly could be the next question, if I remember correctly. Otherwise, I will tell you in a second. Oh, sorry, I've gone backwards. For a bonus, can you cite a case to support the principle that a flexible approach has been recommended by the High Court to the implication of terms in informal contracts? I will give you some options. Hospital Products, Service Station Association, Burger King, or CBA. Are we going to wipe up bloody messes? Are we going to buy petrol? Are we going to eat a burger? Or are we going to go to the bank? I don't know why that amused me as a way of breaking them down, but hey. Oh, less and less people each time. It's so hard when I give you a prep test at the beginning, but I need to work out where we're going to focus our attention today. And there are lots of little videos about all this stuff. So, winners are Hospital Products. So Hospital Products is a difficult case to read, and it's illuminating on a number of different areas. It's a case you will probably come back to in a number of different subjects going forward, because it also looks at beneficial interests and ownership. But what we're looking at it here for is that idea that the flexibility, this 5-point test, that originally started in the Moorcock, in more modern times is in BP Refinery, but in an Australian context has been adopted, but with a flexible approach, a rigid policy of absolute flexibility in Hospital Products. Oh, Harrison, consolidating your lead there. Of course, I can't work out which one you are. Like, there's too many. Oh, actually, no, I can, because there's only one of you here. Terms implied by law. Not a closed class of implied terms. New implied terms in law are added to this class provided certain conditions are met. What would those conditions be? More than one might be correct. I don't know if it'll let you do more than one. New term needs to be based on the presumed intentions of the parties. The new term must relate to a definitive class of contracts. The new term must encompass a duty of good faith. The new term must be able to be implied in all contracts of a particular type. Five, four, three, two, one. A lot of people got in there at the end. Okay, so New term does need to relate to a definitive class of contracts and must be able to be implied in all contracts of the particular type. So let's talk about why the other ones aren't in there, because I think that's easier to think about. So new term must be based on the presumed intentions of the parties. In relation to terms that are implied by law, intention isn't necessarily a factor. So the law just works in that way in relation to all contracts of this particular type, unless it's excluded. So let me give you an example. Contracts between lawyers and their clients. There is an implied duty of good faith, and there are a set of ethical rules that apply to the relationship between lawyers and clients. So the law requires that you keep your client's information absolutely confidential. Okay, you have to act in the best interest of your client, you keep it confidential. And in fact, the rules of engagement for solicitors make it very difficult, if not impossible. In fact, in relation to that duty, it's impossible to contract out of it. You are not delivering legal services if you contract out of that particular thing. So it actually doesn't matter what the client intended or what you intend. So you might have, your client might be, and this happens all the time in practice, oh, you didn't have to keep, you didn't have to send that to me, you can just send it to my kids, or you can send it to my mother-in-law, or just give it to the team, but because, if I'm sending legal product or confidential information that belongs to my client, I can only send it to my client unless they specifically instruct me to send it to someone else, because it's their information. And so even regardless of what they intended from the very beginning, that's how the rule works. In relation to the second one, new term needs to encompass a duty of good faith. That's too narrowing. So that if the new terms may, in fact, encompass a duty of good faith, but that's not the driver. They need to relate to a definitive class of contracts, and they need to apply to all contracts of that type. The new rule might include that that's a good faith obligation. So say, for example, I'm completely making this up as an example, right? But one of the professions that seems to be growing in the world is a chief security officer. So somebody who holds all of the passwords and the keys to stop hacking and do things for organisations. As that role in organisations becomes more and more important, it may well be that the court decides you would need some sort of action for it, that it goes without saying that in every contract of that particular type, there would be a breach of contract if you left the organisation without handing over all of the encryption passwords, or without going through some ethical process for changing them or something like that. I mean, that just seems to me like a sensible kind of thing that might evolve. And it might be, as a nature of that needs to be good faith, but it's not the good faith that drives that new kind of clause. You can hear my voice is going, it's only going to be helping me if you want to, particularly if you want to disagree with me, because then you'll talk for longer. So feel free, just jump in, okay? Really consolidating that lead there. There's a smiley face sneaking up though. A number of principles were outlined in the decision of Constant Industries of Australia and Norwich Winterthur Insurance for implying a term that's based on custom. Which of the following principles were summarised? There might be more than one. A person will not be bound by a custom if they have no knowledge of it. It's a question of fact if a certain custom or usage of a term exists. In order to be implied by custom, the term must be so well known that the parties entering into contracts in that situation have included that term in their contracts. And the term must be inconsistent, may be inconsistent with the express terms of the contract, provided that the parties are aware of it. Oh, finished. Oh, that time went quickly. So, You had it, but then you didn't have it.
I went from second to third, I was right too, but I actually couldn't decide between the two.
You couldn't decide. That's why I like these things, because if you were just doing it in your head, then as soon as that flipped up, your head, if it's anything like mine, would be, yeah, I would have got that. But the actual act of doing it makes you realise in the moment where you're at. And it also just helps me understand where the differences are. So, as it turns out, in relation to terms that apply by custom, in fact, knowledge of the custom doesn't matter. Again, let me give you an example of that. Oh, it's not really a time up. Now I'm struggling to think of one in relation to custom that you might not. Bills of lading. So the way that stevedores work on wharves. Have we spoken about stevedores yet? We always seem to end up needing to talk about stevedores at some point. Does anybody, I was going to say anybody rather than everybody, know what a stevedore is and what they do? I'm married to somebody called Steve, so there's a Steve I adore, but that is not it, which is really good because he would be really suck at this job. So when boats come into a port, they need to load and unload stuff, right? So the people who own boats, they want to do that as quickly as they possibly can and do it as efficiently as they can, because they basically get paid for every lot of loading that they do. So ports are incredibly busy places. Any of you ever sort of sat there at Williamstown with a beer in your hand and looked across at the port and the containers moving around and all the rest of it? There's cranes, they're moving, it's busy all the time, right? They're incredibly dangerous workplaces, right? There's forklifts and cranes and all the rest of it. It's one of the few workplaces that have got no less dangerous over the millennia. Like, ports have been dangerous for a really long time. So it's one of the few areas where the law says, I'm now getting to a different area of law, competition law. On the whole, competition, Australian-style competition law says it's better for consumers and the economy generally if we have lots of competition doing lots of different things. Because the more competitors we have, the more that pushes down price and up quality. But stevedores are a really good exception to that because there's such dangerous workplaces where people are trying to move really quickly. If you had lots of people loading and unloading, that's what stevedores do, it would be a really dangerous thing. So usually ports will have one stevedoring company there, and their job is literally to get the stuff off the ships and out of the port area safely. And so they sit as an interface between the carriers effectively. So stevedores, they've also got a monopoly, right? If you want to deliver stuff to Port Melbourne, you have to deal with the one stevedoring company. And so they've got a huge market power where they can put prices up and they can do a range of different things. So some of the custom of the way that stevedores are paid, it's evolved over time to make sure to balance out those risks. Now, off the top of my head, I cannot right now tell you what any of those weird and unusual provisions are, but that's kind of the point, is if I'm dealing with a stevedore, there's going to be a whole lot of rules that I don't know, I don't understand how they work, and I don't need to, but they're going to apply that way unless my contract specifically changes them. How's that for giving you an example without really giving you an example? Oh, another guest in the house. The High Court has unanimously held that Australian courts should accept a duty of good faith in the performance of contractual obligations. Is this a true or a false statement? I love to see those numbers jump, then they go down, then they go up. I'm feeling you guys are pretty well prepared, given that you had an assignment due, everybody was sick. There was also, this most recent weekend there wasn't an intensive, was there? I know there were, I think the 2 weekends before that though weren't there, between PHAD and intro. So, I will highlight one word. So, the High Court has recognised that there is a duty of good faith, but it hasn't done so unanimously, and certainly not in all contracts. So there's been some discussion about it. So the person to read most in that area is probably Professor Finn, but it's kind of interesting how that's playing out. But it has been regarded as an implied term. What kind of implied term? Again, it might be more than one. Is it a term that's implied in fact, in law, of reasonableness, in custom? Or is this just a trick question? Am I messing with you because the High Court hasn't definitively determined whether a duty of good faith can be implied? Everybody's so quiet.
Yeah, I think our brains are all flat.
Well, mine is too. I don't know, it's all about the students. Like, why can't it all be about me? It's a term implied in fact. So, effectively, if there is a duty of good faith to be implied, it will be implied in fact as a consequence of the intention of the parties and the type of contract that it is. So, again, a little spread there, so we might spend a bit more time on terms implied by fact. The courts have identified a number of standards by which good faith can be measured to ensure that the exercise of good faith takes into account the interests of the other party to the contract. Which of the following are recognised standards? Again, more than one might apply. Cooperation, reasonableness, a legitimate interest, sensibility, not to exercise a contractual power capriciously. You guys at home who are listening to this, I need to check. I'm pretty sure that the quiz that's in Canvas is very similar questions to this, if not the same. Probably a few extra ones because there we can drag things around and have a little bit more fun with it. But if it's not these questions, there'll be something equally entertaining. Okay, so no, there is no standard of cooperation as input into this idea of good faith. There is an idea of reasonableness, so the good faith needs to be a reasonable requirement of the contract, and good faith is tempered by this idea of what is reasonable to the party who has that duty. There needs to be this idea of a legitimate interest. There needs to be a party having a legitimate interest in the act of good faith. And probably the one that's easiest to find is this obligation not to exercise a contractual power capriciously. So just because you have a contractual right doesn't mean you have to use it. I won't get myself caught up in that analogy again. Okay, in Burger King and Hungry Jack's, the court considered if the implied duty of good faith should stop a party from exercising a contractual power capriciously. What did the Supreme Court of New South Wales hold? Whilst there is support in the US for the view, it's not supported in Australia, that there is no such duty, that the franchisor had breached its duty of good faith by deliberately preventing the franchisee from performing its duties under the contract. Another wrong apostrophe, what the? And the franchisee breached its duty of good faith by not performing its contractual obligations. So ultimately here, so do you remember this case? So which one is which? Hungry Jack's is the Australianised version of the American Burger King. Be kind to me. I've been a vegetarian for 30 years. I do not know how these things work, though I am reliably informed by others that they do have a half reasonable vegetarian burger, but I don't really believe it. So in the, is it vegan? It's vegan. Even I'm not that extreme. No, actually. So Burger King basically has given Hungry Jack's the rights to its branding and its methodology to run this this exercise in Australia. The Hungry Jack's company is not doing particularly well. And so effectively Burger King wanted to get out of the contract. They couldn't get out. So what they did is effectively withheld things which they could do perfectly reasonably under the contract. Well, sorry, not reasonably. They weren't breaching their contract, but they effectively made it very difficult for Hungry Jack's to actually perform their side of the bargain. And so then Hungry Jack's couldn't do the things that they wanted to do, so Burger King said, okay, it's all off, we're going to come into Australia and we're going to run our own shop instead and you can't do it anymore. And Hungry Jack's said, well, that's not really fair, because the only reason we didn't succeed under the contract, that we didn't comply, was because you exercised your powers capriciously. And so because they found that the franchisor had breached their duty of good faith by deliberately preventing the franchisee from performing their duties. So they found this idea of good faith as a consequence of withholding the rights. Oh, Harrison, there's no catching you now. Consumer guarantees the Consumer Guarantee Law introduced this idea of consumer guarantees, replacing terms that provided for minimum quality standards in contracts with consumers for the supply of goods and services that was implied by legislation. The Trade Practices Act was one such act that implied these terms. Is that true or is it false? People often enjoy this section because they get to think about shopping. Now, I taught competition and consumer law for a while, and the only thing I know about consumer law I know from going shopping. But basically, if you like shopping, that little section of this course can be quite interesting to you. So, yes, it is true. Basically, before we had the Consumer Guarantee Law, we had what were called statutory warranties. State legislation also incorporated these statutory warranties. So they've been changed from warranties to guarantees, and they have changed around a little bit. They've been around for such a long time now, I'm not going to bother so much with how they were, but when you're looking at the old cases, you will see sometimes that comes up. So in particular, statutory warranty of fitness for purpose, for example, has now become a guarantee. So when we were talking only last night about Lestrange and Graukalb and the vending machine that was faulty, the issue in the case was, did the contract document say, well, we're going to exclude statutory warranties and other things? Now, it turned out that actually you could do that in relation to those statutory warranties at the time, but that's the kind of thing that they were dealing with. Have I got one more? I think maybe one more. In determining if goods or services were purchased by a consumer, which of the following will be taken into consideration? Price of the goods, less than $100,000. The goods purchased are used ordinarily for domestic consumption. I can't speak today. If the cost of the goods or services exceed the amount of $40,000, if the private vehicle is used mainly for transporting goods on private roads, or if the trailer acquired is used mainly for transporting goods on public roads. More than one of these might be correct. And we've run out of time. Yeah, this is just a weird one. I call this the Lindsay Fox exemption. I have no idea why trailers that are used on public roads fit into consumer goods. Like, it's clearly an example of lobbying of some sort. I call it Lindsay Fox. I have no idea whether it's Lindsay Fox, you know, who went for it or not. But I do find this kind of interesting because one of the things that will happen, not so much in this subject, so, and then again, I'm giving you guys advice you're getting into trouble for in other subjects, so I should be quiet. But sometimes you will be asked to give an opinion about how the law should change. And it's really easy to go out and say, yeah, the law here is wrong and that in fact we should be doing this instead and, you know, whatever it happens to be. But actually changing a law is bloody hard. Like, you need to get, these days you really need bipartisan support to get anything through. And then, as we know from the issues that we follow, that, you know, somebody does a backroom deal and the next thing you know, you've got Pauline Hanson as, you know, deputy chair on a commission that you don't need about something that they haven't taken advice on the last commission for. You know, like, that's politics. So, and law and politics work together. So we end up with these odd things. So what's the advice here for this subject is, don't just assume that if it looks and smells like it's a consumer transaction that the consumer law is going to apply. Go and have a look at, when does the consumer law apply? What is a consumer transaction? How does that work? There we go. Must have another one because there's no confetti. The supply of financial services and financial products are regulated under the ACL, the Australian Consumer Law, and also the ASIC Act. Is this true or is this false? Come on, give me some easy ones at the end. You've given up, haven't you? It's too hard. I'm sorry.
I answered like 3.
I know there was one that we had 12, and that's how many people we had in the room, I think. Can I count properly? I'm not sure. I can see you're thinking. Just be brave. Nobody knows. False. False. A little tricky one at the end for the people who go too fast. Supply of financial services and financial products are regulated under the ASIC Act. The terms are almost identical to the Australian Consumer Law, but even though they are consumer products, financial products that might be aimed at consumers, they are excluded from the definition of consumer products because they're dealt with somewhere else. Why? Because we have two really, really big regulators and they basically don't work together very nicely, so they're just going to regulate these things separately. Really more? I clearly got a little bit carried away here. Okay. Hey, we're doing a little bit of every topic, okay, because we're not going to get through it all. Consumer guarantees under the Australian Consumer Law do not apply to goods purchased at auctions. Consequently, do not apply to goods purchased online from websites like eBay. Is this true or false?
The answer is false.
I know what the answer is.
Yeah.
This is a new way of doing it. That's all right. Did that sway? Did people change?
Like people move to one end of the room.
If someone makes me get up, I'm gonna walk straight out.
You are correct. You are correct. So, the rules don't apply in relation to auctions, but the law effectively is that eBay and other online sites are not auctioneers. They are just a location. They are providing a space in which goods can be bought and sold. So even when there is an auction price attached, the law is specific that these consumer goods terms still apply. Why? Because otherwise everybody would be selling their goods at auction with a reserve that was at the recommended retail anyway, just to avoid being caught by the rules. So it's a specific out. And I'm thinking we must be there. Oh no. I'm clearly doing it all. Minor failure by a supplier to comply with the consumer guarantees. What kind of remedies can you get? Might be more than one. Can you get the goods repaired? Can you get them replaced? Can the consumer just say, piss off, I don't want these things? The consumer, can they recover compensation for the diminution, the reduction in the value of the goods? Or can a service contract be terminated? Again, more than one might be correct, more than one might be incorrect. Okay, so yes, you can get stuff repaired. Yes, you can get stuff replaced, but it's a minor issue. So you can't just reject the goods. You can't just, well, they're goods, so you can't terminate the contract. Sort of the last of these, the service contract, is kind of irrelevant. And compensation, because they're of a lesser value, no, you can't get that, but you can go and get your thing repaired or replaced, usually at the option of the vendor.
What about refunds? Where would that fall?
And
Is that like compensation, or is that?
yeah, a refund would be a compensation. That's for a minor defect. It's likely that's at the discretion of the retailer or the manufacturer. They might give a refund, but they don't have to. If it's a minor defect, they have to replace it or repair it. They have to disclose if they're going to use refurbished parts when they're repairing it. But yeah, basically they just have to fix you up. And that applies not just to the retailer, but also to everyone else in the supply chain. So you could go to the wholesaler, you could go to the manufacturer, you can go to anybody in the chain. In what circumstances will a consumer not be permitted to reject goods under the Australian consumer law? If they've lost them, if the goods, well, if the supplier lost them, if the goods were damaged by the supplier, if the period for rejecting goods has ended, or if the goods have been incorporated into real property and cannot be removed without damaging the goods. More than one might be correct. 4, 3, 2, 1. So basically, in all of those cases, except for the one that nobody chose, or one of the ones nobody chose, if the supplier has damaged the goods, then they can be rejected. But in relation to each of the others, there are other remedies, but not terminating the contract. Doesn't mean, by the way, that the supplier can't say, okay, I'm happy to give you your money back, as you just mentioned before. They can do that, but they don't have to. And their own policies might mean that they do that. If goods aren't of an acceptable quality or do not comply with the express warranty made by the manufacturer or do not meet a description, the consumer is permitted to obtain damages from the manufacturer. Yes or no? True or false? We don't really deal with damages, but it was in the chapter. Oh, we've got some confidence, surge of confidence here towards the end, or what I hope is the end. Well, if you're hoping it's the end, why couldn't I hope that it's the end as well? Oh, 50-50. So, interesting. So, if they're not of acceptable quality, they don't comply with the express warranty, or they don't meet the prescription, the description, then the consumer is permitted to obtain damages. Okay, but it needs to fit within those criteria. So it can't be a minor defect, it needs to fall within those criteria. And are we there? Harrison, There was confetti and everything, you didn't notice. It was very exciting. There you go. All right, so from that, where are we going to spend the rest of our time? Because we'll have another hour. We're going to take a break while I change the slide pack over. My thoughts are that we might just do a high-level look at the different kinds of implied terms, and then we might flip straight into... we can flip into the consumer terms. Yeah, maybe we'll start with a high-level view over the others, and so give you some guidance to reading. I've done, I think, quite a good video on the consumer law as well, so we can talk about that then. All right? Don't look so excited. It's so interesting. Let's take 5 minutes. We'll come back at past, and that way everybody can get something to drink.